The Marquis and the Midwife. Chapter 1. The Shadow on the Hill. The village of Thornwood Vale huddled in the valley like a frightened child, its stone cottages clustered together, as if for warmth against the shadow that loomed over them. That shadow came not from the weather, though the autumn winds had begun their mournful sweep across the moors, but from the estate perched on the hill above, a sprawling manor of grey stone and dark windows that caught the last light of day and turned it into something mournful. Smoke rose from its chimneys in thin, reluctant spirals, as if the house itself was hesitant to announce its habitation to the world below. Ilara Marsh had been in Thornwood Vale for exactly 3 days, and she had already grown weary of the whispers. The North Road, the innkeeper had said when she arrived, his eyes darting toward the window as if the very mention of the direction might summon something dreadful from the shadows. "You'll not be wanting to take that one, mistress. Leads only to the manor, and there's nothing for decent folk up that way." "I've no business with manor houses," Ilara had replied, unpacking her satchel of tinctures and herbs onto the worn wooden table that served as both dining surface and examination table in her small room at the Thornwood Inn. The innkeeper's wife had watched with undisguised curiosity as Ilara arranged her meagre possessions, the glass bottles with their cork stoppers, the rolled bundles of clean linen, the small leather-bound journal where she recorded births and deaths and everything between. Only with the living and the soon-to-be living. The manor can keep its mysteries. She was a practical woman, Ilara Marsh. At 28, she had delivered more babies than she could count, held more hands through final breaths than she cared to remember, and learned that fear was a luxury she could not afford. When a woman was bleeding, when a child was breech, when the fever raged and the family looked to her with desperate eyes, fear was useless. Only steady hands and a clear mind mattered. She had learned this lesson early, in the cramped tenements of the city where she had trained, where death was a constant companion and the only sin was letting panic take control. The village matrons had tested her, as they always did. They brought her their aches and their worries, their daughters' pale faces and their husbands' coughs. They watched her work with sharp eyes, judging the quickness of her fingers and the certainty of her touch. Old Mrs. Albright had presented with a rash that had defeated 2 apothecaries. Ilara had identified it within moments as a simple reaction to a new soap and prescribed nothing more costly than a change in washing habits. Young Thomas Keating had been brought in with a fever that had his mother in hysterics. Ilara had sat with him through the night, applying cool compresses and forcing broth between his chattering teeth until the crisis passed. And slowly, grudgingly, the women of Thornwood Vale began to trust her. But always, the whispers returned to the manor on the hill. "The Marquis," old Widow Hempstead murmured on Ilara's second evening, leaning close over a cup of tea in the inn's common room. The fire crackled behind them, casting dancing shadows across the widow's weathered face. "They say he's not right at all. My grandmother remembers when the old Marquis was alive, before the current one, fine man, fine family. But this one—" She shook her head darkly. "What does that mean?" Ilara asked, more interested in the quality of the widow's cough than in local gossip. It was a wet cough, productive but lingering, and Ilara was already mentally composing a treatment of honey and elderflower. "It means," the widow whispered, leaning so close Ilara could smell the tea on her breath, "that no one's seen his face in 15 years. Not since he came back from somewhere. The wars, some say. Others say something worse. Something that happened abroad, in foreign lands where they have strange customs and darker gods." She crossed herself hastily, a gesture that seemed reflexive rather than deeply felt. "He wears masks, different ones depending on the day, black ones, white ones, some plain and some decorated like something from a nightmare, and he'll not let anyone near. Turned away the priest when Father Michael first came to the parish, turned away the doctor when old Dr. Pemberton was still alive, sent back the carriage with a note and enough coin to cover a year's fees, sends a servant down for supplies once a month, and the man won't speak a word to anyone, just pays in gold and leaves with the wagon loaded. Ilara shrugged, adjusting the widow's dose in her mind. A man's face is his own business. I've known plenty of people who hide for reasons that have nothing to do with wickedness. But what's he hiding? The widow pressed, her eyes gleaming with the particular hunger of those who have few entertainments. In a village this remote, gossip was currency, entertainment, and theology all rolled into one. What's so terrible he can't show it? My grandson saw him once, years ago, when the carriage passed too close to the village on its way to somewhere. Said he looked like something from a nightmare, all twisted and wrong. The boy didn't sleep proper for a month. I've seen terrible things, Widow Hempstead. A face is rarely among them. Ilara stood, gathering her things with the efficient movements of someone who had learned not to waste time. Take that tincture 3 times a day and try the honey for that cough. I'll check on you next week if the weather holds. And Widow Hempstead? Yes, child. The next time your grandson sees the Marquis's carriage, tell him to look for the man inside, not the mask. He might learn something worth knowing. On her 3rd day, as the autumn sun was painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Ilara was summoned to the blacksmith's cottage. His wife, a sturdy woman named Anne, who had already borne 4 children with the ease of a cat producing kittens, had begun her labours early. The birth was difficult, but not dangerous. The baby was positioned awkwardly, stubborn as its father. Anne had gasped through gritted teeth. And by evening, Ilara held a squalling, red-faced boy in her hands, while the blacksmith wept with joy in the corner, his massive shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. "You've got a strong one here," Ilara told them, placing the wrapped bundle in Anne's exhausted arms. "Good lungs, good colour. He'll be swinging a hammer before you know it." "Thank you," Anne breathed, her face transformed by the particular radiance of new motherhood. "Thank you. What do we owe you?" "We'll talk about that tomorrow," Ilara said, already reaching for her coat. "Right now, you need rest, and this little one needs his mother's warmth. Send for me if there's any trouble, but I don't expect there will be." It was on her walk back to the inn, exhausted and content in that particular way that followed a successful birth, that she saw the rider. The horse was lathered, its flanks heaving and foam-flecked as it galloped down the north road toward the village at a pace that spoke of desperation rather than haste. The rider was a woman, young, Ilara saw as she drew closer, with dark hair escaping from a hasty knot and a face twisted with such naked desperation that Ilara's feet were already moving before her mind had fully registered what she was seeing. She wore fine clothes, a riding habit of deep blue wool that must have cost more than the blacksmith earned in a year, but they were dishevelled, the jacket buttoned wrong, the skirt torn at the hem. And there was something in her eyes that made Ilara's midwife instincts sharpen to a razor's edge. "You!" the woman cried, reining in so sharply the horse reared, its hooves slicing the air inches from Ilara's face. The woman didn't even seem to notice. "Are you the midwife? The new one? The one they're all talking about in the village?" "I am," Ilara said calmly, her heart steady despite the near miss. She had learned long ago that panicking around frightened horses helped no one. "Ilara Marsh, what's happened? Who's hurt?" "My sister." The woman's voice cracked, splintered like ice under too much weight. "The Marquis's sister. She's my sister too. I'm Marguerite, Lady Marguerite Ashworth. My sister Celeste is at the manor. She's labouring. Too early. The baby... Something's wrong. The healer we had, the woman who usually comes from the next county, she's away and we didn't know. We didn't think the baby would come for another month at least. And now..." She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth as if to physically hold back the sob that threatened to escape. Ilara was already moving, calculating distances and supplies in her head. "How far along is she?" 8 months, maybe a little more. But the pain started this morning and they haven't stopped and she's bleeding. Not a lot, but some. And the baby, "The baby isn't moving right," Marguerite said. She was Marguerite, and she was falling apart, and Ilara had seen this before in the fathers and mothers and siblings who stood helpless while their loved ones suffered. "Listen to me." Ilara's voice cut through the panic like a blade through fog. "Lady Marguerite, look at me." The young woman's eyes, wild and wet, focused on Ilara's face. "I need you to be calm. Your sister needs you to be calm. Can you do that?" A nod, shaky but determined. "Good. Now tell me, is there anyone else at the manor who knows anything about birth? A mother, an older servant, anyone at all?" "No, just Barton, the butler, and a few maids. They're all as useless as I am. Celeste is all I have. She's all any of us have." "Then you'll have to be useful." Ilara was already calculating. The north road was steep, the manor perhaps 2 miles distant. On foot it would take too long. "Can your horse carry 2? "What?" "Your horse. Can it carry both of us? I'm not heavy, and I've ridden before. If we're quick, we might still have time." Marguerite looked at her as if she'd grown a second head. You'll come? Even knowing what they say about my brother? Even knowing he'll probably turn you away at the gates?" Ilara thought of the woman labouring too early, the baby in distress, the desperate ride. She thought of the masks and the whispers and the 15 years of isolation. Then she thought of what it would mean to let fear stop her from doing what she was born to do. "I've never been turned away from a birth yet," she said, reaching for the horse's stirrup, "and I don't intend to start now." Chapter 2. The Gates of Stone. The ride up the north road was unlike anything Ilara had experienced in her years of travelling between villages and cottages. The road itself was well maintained, the stones carefully set and free of the ruts that plagued the lower paths, but the forest that pressed in on either side had an unnatural quality. Too quiet, too still, as if the very birds had learned to hold their breath in the presence of the manor above. Ancient oaks stretched their branches across the road like clasped hands, filtering the fading light into patterns of green and gold that seemed to shift and move at the edge of vision. Marguerite rode before her, guiding the horse with the unconscious skill of someone who had been in the saddle since childhood, but her shoulders were rigid with tension. Ilara could feel the younger woman's fear through the points where their bodies touched, a fine trembling that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "How old is your sister?" Ilara asked, partly to gather information and partly to distract Marguerite from the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. 18. Just 18. She's so young, too young for this, for any of this. Marguerite's voice was raw. "Our mother died when Celeste was born. I raised her after that, or tried to. Our brother, the Marquis, he was already gone by then, already hiding up here, and I was only 12 myself. But Celeste was such a happy baby, such a joyful child. She deserved better than this life, better than being hidden away like some shameful secret. Why does she stay? If the Marquis won't leave the manor, why doesn't she?" A long pause. The horse's hooves clattered against the stones, the only sound in the watching forest. "Because she loves him," Marguerite said finally. "Because when he came back from the war, from whatever happened to him, he tried to send us both away. Told us he was a monster, that we shouldn't look at him, that we should forget we ever had a brother. I was older. I remembered him before. I couldn't stay. It was too hard, seeing what he'd become, knowing I couldn't help. But Celeste, she was only 3. She didn't remember him any other way. To her, he was just her brother, the only father she'd ever known. She refused to leave. Refused for 15 years. Marguerite's voice broke. And now she might die, and I couldn't even be there. I was in London, I didn't know, I didn't. You're here now." Ilara's voice was calm, steady, the same voice she used with labouring mothers when the pain threatened to overwhelm them. "That's what matters. You're here now." The manor gates rose before them like something from a fairy tale, the kind of fairy tale where the princess is locked in a tower and the hero must brave terrible dangers to reach her. They were iron, twice the height of a man, their intricate scrollwork twisted into shapes that might have been flowers or might have been something darker, depending on how the light caught them. Vines had grown through the bars over the years, their leaves brown and curling with autumn, as if even nature had given up trying to breach this particular barrier. They were closed, as they had been closed to every visitor for 15 years. Marguerite slid from the horse before the animal had fully stopped, landing awkwardly and running to the gates. She beat against the iron with her fists, the sound ringing through the still air like a bell tolling. "Open! Open the gates! It's Marguerite! I've brought help! I've brought a midwife! Celeste needs her! Please, please, open!" For a long moment, nothing happened. The manor beyond the gates sat dark and silent, its windows reflecting nothing but the dying light. Ilara dismounted more carefully, her satchel heavy on her shoulder, and stood calmly beside the lathered horse. She had learned patience in the long hours of labour, in the waiting between contractions when nothing could be done but breathe and hope. She had learned that panic was a luxury, that fear accomplished nothing, that the only way through darkness was to keep moving forward one step at a time. Marguerite beat against the gates again, her cries growing more desperate. "Please, I'm begging you! She's going to die, do you understand? My sister is going to die if you don't let us in." Then, slowly, with a groan of protesting hinges that spoke of long disuse, the gates swung inward. The servant who opened them was an old man, with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that held a lifetime of secrets. He was stooped with age, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but there was something in his bearing, a remnant of military posture perhaps, or simply the dignity of long service, that spoke of a man who had seen much and forgotten nothing. He looked at Ilara with something like wonder, like fear, like desperate hope all tangled together in an expression too complex to name. "This way," he said, and his voice was rustier than the gates. "Quickly. Her ladyship is fading." They followed him through a courtyard gone to weed, past fountains that had not flowed in years, their basins filled with dead leaves and stagnant water. The manor itself loomed before them, a great grey pile of stone that might once have been beautiful but now seemed merely forbidding. Through a great oak door, black with age, they entered a hall so dim it took Ilara's eyes a moment to adjust. The manor was not ruined, she saw as her vision cleared. It was maintained, meticulously, even lovingly maintained, but as a place to be hidden from rather than lived in. The curtains were drawn, heavy velvet that blocked every hint of outside light. The candles were few and far between, their flames guttering in crystal sconces that must have cost a fortune. The furniture was draped in shadows, elegant pieces that had probably been chosen by someone's grandmother and never updated. Everything spoke of preservation rather than habitation, of a life suspended rather than lived. From above came a sound that cut through the stillness like a blade through silk, a woman's cry, raw with pain and fear, followed by a sob that went on and on until it seemed it would never stop. Ilara did not wait for permission. She followed the sound, taking the stairs two at a time, her satchel bumping against her hip, leaving Marguerite and the old servant to follow as they could. The staircase curved upward through the darkness, past landings hung with portraits she had no time to examine, past doors closed and locked against intruders, past everything that wasn't the sound of a woman in labour. The door at the top of the stairs was open, and light spilled out, warm light from a fire that crackled and spat, chasing shadows across the walls. The room beyond was a bedchamber, elegant and feminine, with rose-patterned wallpaper and delicate furniture, and a bed hung with curtains of pale silk. On that bed, a woman lay twisted in the sheets, her face white as milk, her dark hair plastered to her forehead in damp tangles. Young, younger than Marguerite, younger than Ilara herself. A girl, really, no more than 18, her face still rounded with the softness of youth, even as pain carved lines into it. But it was the man Ilara saw first. He stood at the foot of the bed, his back to her, his hands clenched at his sides with such force that she could see the tendons standing out like cords. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black from head to foot. Black coat, black waistcoat, black trousers, black boots, polished to a dull gleam. And on his head, where his face should have been visible, there was instead a mask. It was not the plain mask the villagers had described. This one was elaborate, beautiful in its way, black velvet worked with silver thread in patterns that might have been leaves or flames or something else entirely. It covered everything from hairline to jaw, leaving only his eyes visible. And those eyes, dark, deep-set, filled with such naked anguish that Ilara felt her heart clench in response, were fixed on the woman on the bed. He turned at her entrance, and even through the mask she could feel the force of his attention, the desperate hope and terrible fear that radiated from him like heat from the fire. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his gaze dropped to her satchel, to the worn leather and the bottles visible within, and something shifted in those dark eyes. "You're the midwife," he said. His voice was low, roughened by disuse or emotion or both, but there was music in it still, the remains of what must once have been a cultured, educated tone. "You came." "I came," Ilara said simply. There was no time for explanations, no time for the fear she could see warring with hope behind his mask. "Now step aside. I need to see to your sister." For a heartbeat, he did not move, and she saw his hands tighten further, the knuckles going white. This was a man who had spent 15 years controlling his world, controlling who saw him and when, controlling every aspect of a life reduced to the boundaries of this manor. And now, a stranger stood in his most private space, giving him orders. Then he stepped back, yielding the space around the bed, and Ilara Marsh went to work. She assessed the situation in seconds, the way she always did. The girl, Lady Celeste, Marguerite had said, was perhaps 8 months along, too early for an easy birth. The baby was positioned wrong, transverse, a shoulder presenting where the head should be. The labour had been going on too long, hours, perhaps most of the day, and the girl was exhausted, her reserves depleted, her strength fading with every contraction. She was bleeding, not heavily but steadily, a trickle that spoke of placental disruption or perhaps cervical damage, and if something did not change soon, if the baby could not be turned and delivered, both mother and child would be lost. "I need hot water," Ilara said, her voice calm and steady, the same voice she had used in 100 birthings. "Clean cloths, as many as you have. More light. Bring every candle and lamp in the house. And I need everyone who is not helping to leave this room." "I'm not leaving." The Marquis's voice was iron, absolute, admitting no argument. Ilara looked up at him, at the mask that hid everything and revealed nothing. She was tired, she realized. Tired from the walk, tired from the birth she'd just attended, tired from 3 days of proving herself to suspicious villagers. And perhaps that tiredness was what made her brave, or perhaps she was simply too focused on the task at hand to care about protocol and propriety. "Can you be useful?" she asked bluntly. Something shifted behind the mask, surprise certainly, and perhaps the ghost of an emotion she couldn't name. For 15 years no one had spoken to him like this. For 15 years everyone had tiptoed around his isolation, his masks, his refusal to be seen. And now this woman, this practical, no-nonsense woman with her satchel of herbs and her steady hands, was asking him if he could be useful. "I can do whatever is needed," he said. "Then hold her hand. Talk to her. Keep her here with us." Ilara turned back to the bed, already reaching for her supplies. "Lady Celeste, I'm Ilara. I've delivered more babies than I can count, and I've never lost a mother yet. I don't intend to start with you, but I need you to listen to me and do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" The girl's eyes, huge and dark in her pale face, fixed on Ilara's with desperate trust. She was so young, Ilara thought, so terribly young to be facing this alone, without a mother to hold her hand, without any of the support that should have surrounded her at this moment. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, please. It hurts so much. I can't do this." "You can." Ilara's voice was firm but gentle. "You're stronger than you know, and I'm going to help you. Now, I need you to take a deep breath for me, that's it. And another. Good. Now let's see what this baby of yours is up to." The Marquis moved to his sister's side and took her hand in both of his. He did not speak at first, but something passed between them, a communication beyond words, born of years of shared isolation and love that asked no questions. Then he began to murmur to her, soft words that Ilara couldn't quite catch, and Celeste's rigid body relaxed by a fraction. Ilara set to work. Chapter 3. The Face Beneath the Mask. Hours passed. The fire burned low and was built up again by hands that came and went in the periphery of Ilara's vision. Marguerite appeared with water and cloths, her face tear-streaked but her hands steady. The old servant, Barton, Ilara learned from snatches of conversation, materialized with food that no one touched, with extra candles that pushed back the shadows, with blankets and pillows and everything Ilara might need. Through it all, the Marquis never moved from his sister's side. He held her hand through every contraction, his grip firm but gentle, anchoring her to the present moment when the pain threatened to sweep her away. He murmured to her when she flagged, his voice a constant thread of comfort running through the chaos. He met Ilara's eyes when she needed something passed to her, anticipating her needs with an intuition that spoke of sharp intelligence and close observation. His presence in the room was constant, a pillar of stillness in the storm of birth. And gradually, without meaning to, without even realizing it was happening, Ilara began to see past the mask. She saw it in the way he smoothed the hair back from Celeste's forehead, gentle as a mother with a newborn, his gloved fingers tracing patterns on her skin that seemed to soothe her. She saw it in the tension of his shoulders when the baby's heartbeat faltered, in the way his whole body went rigid with fear before he forced himself to relax for his sister's sake. She saw it in the quiet authority with which he anticipated needs, passing Ilara instruments before she asked, adjusting the light when it fell wrong, wetting cloths to cool Celeste's burning forehead. This was not a monster. This was a man who loved his sister beyond measure, who had devoted 15 years of his life to protecting her from a world that had shown him only cruelty. This was a man who had built a prison for himself so that she might have a sanctuary. "The baby's position isn't changing," Ilara said quietly, after another examination had confirmed her fears. They were approaching a crisis point, she knew, the kind of moment when decisions had to be made and lives hung in the balance. "I've tried everything I know to turn it, but it's stubborn. We need to consider other options." "What options?" The Marquis's voice was steady, but his eyes were dark with fear. "I can try to deliver the baby as it is. It's risky, for both of them. The cord could compress, the baby could go into distress, your sister could hemorrhage." Ilara met his gaze directly. "Or I can attempt to turn the baby manually. That's also risky, and it will be extremely painful for your sister. But if it works, the birth becomes straightforward." "Which option gives them the best chance?" Ilara considered. This was the question she always dreaded, the one that forced her to weigh lives against each other, to make choices that would haunt her regardless of the outcome. "The manual turning," she said finally. "If it works, the birth becomes normal. If it doesn't, we're no worse off than we are now. But I need you to understand. This will hurt her, badly, and she needs to be as still as possible while I do it." The Marquis looked at his sister, at her pale face and exhausted eyes. Then he leaned close to her, his masked face inches from hers, and spoke in a voice so low Ilara couldn't hear the words. Celeste listened, nodded weakly, and turned her gaze to Ilara. "Do it," she whispered. "Whatever you need to do. I trust you." Ilara had heard those words before, from 100 mothers in 100 rooms. They never got easier. They never stopped feeling like a weight placed on her shoulders, a burden of trust that she had to be worthy of. "Marguerite," she said, "I need you to hold your sister's shoulders. Keep her as still as you can. Marquis, hold her hand and keep talking to her. Don't stop, no matter what. Can you do that?" He nodded, his eyes never leaving his sister's face. "Then let's begin." What followed was the longest hour of Ilara's life. She worked with steady hands and focused mind, blocking out everything but the task before her, the delicate manipulation of flesh and bone, the coaxing of a stubborn child into the position nature intended. Celeste screamed, long raw cries that seemed to tear themselves from the depths of her soul, and through it all the Marquis never stopped talking, never stopped holding her hand, never stopped being the anchor she needed. And then, finally, miraculously, the baby turned. Ilara sat back, sweat running down her face, her hands trembling with exhaustion. "It's done," she said. "The baby's in position. Now we need to push." Celeste was beyond responding, beyond anything but the primal instinct to bring this child into the world. But she pushed when Ilara told her to push, rested when Ilara told her to rest, and through it all, her brother's voice guided her, encouraged her, loved her through the darkness. "One more push," Ilara said, her voice the calm center of the storm. "Celeste, I need one more. The baby's almost here. One more, and you'll meet your child." Celeste gathered herself for one final effort, her face contorted with pain and determination, and she pushed with everything she had left. The scream that tore from her throat seemed to go on forever, raw and primal and utterly human. And then the baby slid into Ilara's waiting hands. For one terrible heartbeat, the child was still, too still, a tiny wizened thing with no breath and no cry. His skin was bluish, his limbs limp, his eyes closed as if in eternal sleep. Ilara moved without thinking, without breathing, without allowing herself to feel the fear that clawed at the edges of her mind. She cleared the airway with practiced fingers, rubbed the small back with firm circular motions, held the tiny body close and willed life into it with every fibre of her being. And then a cry split the air, thin, reedy, but unmistakably alive. It was the most beautiful sound Ilara had ever heard. She laughed, the sound startling in the quiet room, half sob and half shout of joy. "A boy," she said, her voice breaking. "You have a son, a healthy son." Celeste's face, exhausted and radiant beyond words, turned toward the sound. "Let me see him. Please. Please let me see him." Ilara placed the baby on his mother's chest, positioning him carefully, watching as his tiny fingers curled instinctively around Celeste's thumb. And as she did, she looked up and met the eyes behind the mask. They were wet with tears, dark eyes, deep set, holding more emotion than she had seen in any face, masked or unmasked. Gratitude, wonder, love, relief. They were all there, naked and unguarded, and Ilara realized with a start that she was seeing the real man for the first time. "Thank you," the Marquis said. His voice broke on the word, shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Thank you. I don't know how. I don't know what." Ilara nodded, suddenly unable to speak. The moment was too large for words, too profound for the small offerings of language. She simply nodded, and he nodded back, and in that exchange was everything that needed to be said. It was then that the mask shifted. Perhaps it was the emotion of the moment, the hours of tension finally releasing in a flood of feeling. Perhaps it was simply that the ties had loosened with sweat and strain, or that he had forgotten for one unguarded instant to hold it in place. Whatever the cause, the mask slipped, just slightly, just enough to reveal a strip of skin at the jaw where the velvet pulled away. The Marquis's hand flew up to catch it, to hold it in place with desperate fingers, but it was too late. Ilara had seen. She had seen, and she had not flinched. The skin beneath was twisted, scarred, burned, she realized immediately, the kind of scarring that came from prolonged exposure to flame. It pulled at the corner of his mouth, distorting what might once have been a handsome face into something that would make children stare and adults look away in discomfort. The scars extended upward, she could see now, disappearing beneath the mask's edge, a landscape of pain that covered half his face, perhaps more. It was, she realized with sudden clarity, the kind of injury that came not from birth but from violence, from fire, from something terrible enough to make a man hide from the world for 15 years. And in that instant, she understood everything. The masks, the isolation, the refusal to be seen. She understood the children screaming, the woman fainting, the man crossing himself and running for the priest. She understood why a man would choose solitude over the daily torture of other people's reactions. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the midwife and the Marquis, separated by a bed and a sleeping mother and a newborn's first cries. His hand still held the mask in place, but his eyes were naked, stripped of all pretense, waiting for the flinch that must surely come. It didn't. Instead, Ilara said quietly, "I've seen worse." His eyes widened behind the mask. The hand holding it in place trembled slightly. "I've seen a woman whose face was torn apart by a plough blade," Ilara continued, her voice matter-of-fact, the same voice she used to discuss treatments and prognoses. The horse bolted while she was in the field, dragged her half a mile before anyone could stop it. Her husband carried her to me in his arms, both of them covered in blood, and I didn't think she'd live through the night. She did. I delivered her baby 3 months later. The baby was perfect. The husband cried when he saw them both alive. She paused. She wears the scars, but he says he doesn't see them anymore, just sees her. The Marquis said nothing, but his eyes never left her face. "I've seen men with half their faces gone from fever," Ilara went on. "I've seen children born with marks and twists and turns that made their parents weep, and the village elders whisper about curses and changelings. I've seen burns and wounds and the aftermath of accidents that would turn your stomach. And you know what I've learned?" "What?" His voice was barely a whisper. "That a face is just the front of a person. The rest, the part that matters, is underneath." She gestured toward the bed, toward Celeste and her newborn son. "I've seen more of you in the last few hours than I've seen of most men in a lifetime. I've seen how you love your sister. I've seen how you held her hand and talked to her and never once thought of yourself. I've seen the kind of man you are when the masks come off, literally and figuratively. And what I've seen, I like." The Marquis stared at her for a long moment. The fire crackled behind them, casting dancing shadows across the room. Somewhere in the bed, Celeste murmured in her sleep, the baby secure in her arms. And in the silence between them, something shifted, something fragile and tentative and infinitely precious. Then, slowly, with hands that trembled only slightly, the Marquis reached up and removed the mask. Chapter 4. The Light on the Hill. The face that Ilara saw was worse than she had imagined, and less terrible. The scarring was extensive, covering the entire left side from brow to jaw, pulling the eye downward into a permanent droop, distorting the mouth into a lopsided half-frown that made speaking or eating an obvious challenge. The skin was a landscape of ridges and valleys, of burns healed badly and wounds that had festered before they closed, a patchwork of old injuries that told a story of agony survived rather than escaped. The left ear was little more than a crumpled remnant, and the hair above it had never grown back, leaving a bald patch that the remaining dark hair was carefully combed to conceal. It was, objectively, difficult to look upon. Ilara understood, in that moment, why children screamed. She understood why women fainted and men crossed themselves. The human brain was not designed to process such extensive injury without a moment of shock, without a visceral reaction that had nothing to do with kindness or cruelty and everything to do with simple biology. But the eyes, those dark, deep-set eyes, were the same eyes that had held his sister's hand through the long hours of labor. The mouth, even distorted, was the same mouth that had murmured comfort to a frightened girl. The hands that now held the mask, scarred themselves from the same fire that had marked his face, were the same hands that had passed Ilara instruments and smoothed back hair and welcomed a new life into the world. Ilara looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at a patient, the way she looked at a new mother, the way she looked at anyone who deserved to be seen clearly. She looked until the scars became just another feature, until the face before her became as familiar as any other, until she could see the man beneath the damage. "It was a fire," he said quietly. The words came slowly, haltingly, as if he had not spoken of this in years, as perhaps he had not. 15 years ago. I was in the army, serving with a regiment in the peninsula. We were camped near a village when the French attacked at night, a surprise assault, torches and fire arrows, and men screaming in the darkness. I pulled 3 men from the burning tents before the roof fell on me. He touched his face, lightly, as if the memory still had the power to hurt. They survived. All 3 of them. I survived too, after a fashion. "And you've hidden yourself away ever since," Ilara said. It was not a question. "I tried to go back. After I healed, after the surgeons had done what they could, I tried to return to normal life." His voice was distant, remembering. "The army gave me a pension, a hero's discharge. They said I'd done bravely, that I should be proud. The first time I walked through a village on my way home, children screamed, a woman fainted in the street. A man crossed himself and ran for the priest, shouting about demons and possession." He closed his eyes. I understood. I did. I couldn't blame them. They'd never seen anything like me, never imagined such damage was possible while still living. But I couldn't live with it either. Couldn't live with being a thing that made people afraid. He looked down at his sister, at the baby sleeping on her chest, and his ruined face softened into something almost beautiful. "So I came here, and I stayed. Celeste was 3 years old then. She didn't understand why her brother looked different, didn't care about the scars. She just wanted me to read her stories and push her on the swing. When I tried to send her away, to send both my sisters away so they wouldn't have to live with a monster, she refused. Absolutely refused. Said I was still her brother, and she didn't care what I looked like." A smile touched the distorted mouth, transforming it. "She's always been stubborn." "She gets it from you," Ilara said. He looked up sharply, and she met his gaze without flinching. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or wonder, or the first stirrings of something he had not felt in 15 years. "You've been hiding," Ilara said quietly. "But you haven't just been hiding from the world. You've been hiding from yourself. From the man you used to be, the man you thought you'd lost in that fire." She gestured at the room, the manor, the life he'd built in isolation. "But he's still here. I saw him tonight, holding his sister's hand, welcoming his nephew into the world, being exactly who he needed to be when it mattered most." The Marquis was silent for a long moment. Behind them, the fire crackled and settled, casting warm light across the room. In the bed, Celeste stirred slightly, her arms tightening protectively around her son. and in the silence, something grew between them, something fragile and new, like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Your full name, I mean." "Ilara Marsh, daughter of a village apothecary and a mother who died bringing me into the world. Trained in the city, practiced in a dozen villages, never stayed long enough to put down roots." She smiled slightly. "Until now, perhaps." "Ilara Marsh." He said it carefully, as if memorizing it, tasting each syllable. "You came when my sister needed you. You didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate, didn't let fear or rumor stop you. You saved 2 lives tonight. 3 if you count my own, because I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost her." He looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, something warm and wondering and utterly without the guarded quality she had seen before. "How can I ever repay you?" Ilara considered the question. She thought of the village below, the whispers and the fear, the shadow that had loomed over Thornwood Vale for 15 years. She thought of the man before her, hiding from a world that had shown him only cruelty. She thought of the baby, who would grow up knowing his uncle's face without ever learning to fear it, who would never understand why the villagers crossed themselves when the carriage passed. She thought of all the years ahead, all the possibilities, all the doors that might open if only someone would push. "You can start," she said, "by coming down to the village tomorrow, just for an hour, just to be seen. Let them learn what I learned tonight, that the man behind the mask is worth knowing." He flinched, his hand instinctively moving toward his face before stopping in mid-air. "They'll scream. They'll run. They'll cross themselves and call for the priest." "Some will," Ilara agreed. "Some always do. Fear is easier than understanding, and habit is harder to break than any chain." She smiled, a warm, practical smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "But some won't. Some will be curious. Some will remember that you saved 3 men from a fire, that you've been paying fair prices for supplies for 15 years without ever causing trouble, that your sister is a kind young woman who's never done anyone harm, and the ones who stay, the ones who look past the scars and see the man, those are the ones worth knowing." She paused, then added quietly, "I'll be there. I'll make sure no one faints." In the end, it took 3 days, not 1. There were arrangements to make, a sister to recover, a nephew to adore. There were long conversations in the quiet hours when Celeste slept and the baby nursed and the house settled into its nightly rhythms. There were moments of doubt and fear when the Marquis would reach for his mask and Ilara would gently take his hand and remind him that he had survived worse than awkward silences. On the 2nd day, Ilara walked down to the village alone to check on the blacksmith's wife and attend to Widow Hempstead's cough. She said nothing about the manor, nothing about the birth, nothing about the man behind the mask. But she smiled more than she had since arriving, and the villagers noticed. On the 3rd day, as the autumn sun rose golden over the hills, the Marquis of Thornwood Vale walked down the north road into the village, wearing no mask at all. Ilara was waiting at the inn, and she walked beside him as the first villagers stared, whispered, crossed themselves, and slowly, gradually, began to see what she had seen. The blacksmith was first, coming out of his forge with his newborn son in his arms. He looked at the Marquis, really looked, and then he nodded, just once, a simple acknowledgement that spoke volumes. "Fine morning, my lord," he said. The Marquis hesitated, then nodded back. "It is. Fine morning for a walk." After that, others approached, tentatively at first, with sidelong glances and nervous coughs. But they approached. They saw the man behind the scars, and some of them, like the blacksmith, decided to stay. It would not happen overnight. There would be stares for years, whispers for a generation, fear that would take time to fade. But that day, a seed was planted, the understanding that a face is just the front of a person and that the rest, the part that matters, lies beneath. Weeks passed. Autumn deepened into winter, and the manor on the hill no longer seemed quite so dark. Lights appeared in windows that had been shuttered for years. Smoke rose from chimneys in cheerful plumes. And sometimes, on market days, the Marquis would walk down to the village with his sister and her growing son, and he would talk to people, and they would talk to him, and slowly the shadow on the hill became just another house among houses. The midwife who had stormed the gate stayed in Thornwood Vale. She delivered babies and tended the sick, and grew old in the shadow of the manor on the hill. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, she walked up the North Road to visit old friends, the Marquis with the scarred face, his sister with her growing family, and the children who had never learned to be afraid. They called her the bravest woman in the village, but Ilara Marsh knew better. She hadn't been brave. She had simply been practical. A woman needed help. A man needed to be seen. And a midwife of all people knew that new life could come from the most unlikely places. The manor on the hill was no longer a shadow. It was a home, lit from within, waiting with open doors for anyone who cared to visit. And some did. More and more, as the years passed, they did. The end.
If you